The night the cold found her, it did not howl or announce itself. It simply settled into her bones the way grief does, quietly and without mercy, until every breath felt borrowed. Snow spread across the valley like a sheet drawn over a wounded body, and the cabin stood alone, a rib of timber against the dark, smoke thinning from its chimney as if even fire was tired of staying alive. She came from the tree line on her knees, because walking had abandoned her miles back, because pride freezes faster than blood. The man at the cabin door heard the sound before he saw her, the scrape of palm on ice, the wet hitch of breath that comes when lungs argue with winter. When he opened the door, lamplight fell on her face and revealed a woman young enough to still believe in mornings, old enough to know how easily they can be taken. Her hair was braided but broken, beads dull with frost, fringe stiff with snow, and the small cuts on her arms were not dramatic wounds, but the honest marks of a long refusal to die. She looked up not to plead first, but to measure. Her eyes moved like a scout's, taking in Boots' hands, the weight of the man's stance, the way the wind curled around him and left her alone. She spoke then, because silence was killing her faster than fear, and her voice was roughened by cold and resolve. She did not say her name because names can be stolen. She did not say where she had come from, because places can be burned. She said only that the night was cruel, that she would not survive it, and that if he let her cross the threshold, she would stay, she would work, she would share the long hours of darkness so he would not sleep alone. It was a promise shaped by desperation, not seduction, and the man heard the difference even if he did not yet understand it. He had lived long enough with silence to recognize another kind of hunger when it spoke. He saw the way her hands shook, not theatrically but with the betrayal of muscles that had already surrendered. He saw how she angled her body so she could spring if he lunged, even now, even here. Winter pressed its mouth to her back and whispered its ultimatum. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and ash, of bread cooling and boots drying, of a life reduced to what could be carried and burned. He could close the door and let the cold finish what it had started. He could open it and invite trouble, memory, and a stranger's story into the only piece he had left. The moment stretched, a thin bridge over a deep ravine, and on that bridge stood a woman who refused to beg in a way that would cost her more than the cold already had. When he stepped aside, it was not heroism that moved him, but recognition, the knowledge that survival often begins with a threshold crossed. She crawled forward, collapsed just inside the door, and the wind slammed against the cabin as if angry at being cheated. He barred it, fed the fire, wrapped her in a blanket without touching her skin, and waited for the truth to arrive when her shaking slowed. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing tracks, erasing choices, as if the night itself wanted to pretend this meeting had been inevitable. If this story has already pulled you in, if you feel the cold, the choice, the fragile spark of mercy, remember to subscribe to the channel, because every chapter that follows depends on readers who choose to step inside rather than turn away. Morning did not come gently. It came white and loud, the world shouting its existence through frost-cracked boards and a sun that felt like an accusation. She woke on the floor by the hearth, wrapped and alive, and for a moment she let herself believe the fire had always been there. That warmth was not a borrowed thing. The man sat at the table with his back to her, mending a glove, his movements economical, the habit of someone who measures life in useful gestures. She pushed herself upright slowly, announcing every inch of motion so he would not mistake survival for threat, and she thanked him, not with words polished for gratitude, but with a simple honesty of breath that no longer scraped. He nodded and slid a cup toward her without turning, steam lifting like a promise kept. They spoke then carefully, like two people crossing a river on stones they did not fully trust. She told him she had been running, that the land she loved had become a corridor of fear. That hunger had chased her into choices she would never romanticize. She told him that what she offered the night before was not a lie, but a boundary. Companionship without ownership, warmth without chains, work without erasure. He listened without interrupting, because listening had saved him before. He told her his cabin was not a refuge but a pause. That winter would still be winter tomorrow, that trouble has a way of sniffing out smoke. She said she knew, and that knowing had never stopped her feet from moving. They negotiated not with romance but with rules, chores named, space respected, the door unbarred in daylight, the fire tended together at night. She worked like someone who had been denied rest and refused to accept the insult any longer. splitting wood, mending nets, cooking with the precision of hunger remembered. In the evenings they sat across the hearth, sharing stories that circled truth without landing, because some truths need time to cool before they can be handled. The cold kept testing the cabin, and the cabin held, and something quieter than hope began to assemble itself between them. Trust built not on promises but on repeated proof. When the wind roared, she did not reach for him, and when nightmares woke her, he did not ask their names. Respect grew in that negative space, a shelter made of restraint. Yet the world does not reward quiet agreements forever. Tracks appeared near the creek, too many, too careless, and smoke from distant camps braided with the sky in a way that tightened her jaw. She sharpened knives not to threaten but to remember who she was, and he noticed without comment. When the night deepened and the fire dimmed, she spoke again, softer than before, and said that survival had taught her a truth harder than hunger. That sharing warmth is not the same as surrendering self, he answered with a silence that accepted the lesson. If you're feeling the tension build, the fragile accord, the storm on the horizon, subscribe now. Your support keeps this fire burning and brings you the next chapter before the cold can catch it. The knock came at dusk. Not loud, not polite, a fist testing the cabin the way a wolf tests a fence. The man rose, and she stood with him, not behind, because fear shared is lighter than fear carried alone. Outside, voices carried the casual cruelty of men who believe the land owes them answers. Inside, the fire hummed and the rules they had made suddenly mattered. She spoke first through the door, not naming herself, not apologizing for existing, and told them the truth shaped like a boundary. There was nothing for them here. The voices laughed, the sound thin in the cold, and the knock returned heavier. What followed was not a battle sung into legend, but a series of small, decisive moments, bolts slid, angles chosen, words used like tools instead of weapons. The men left marks on the snow and took their noise with them, because persistence is not the same as courage when it meets preparation. When silence returned, it was different now, warmed by relief and a knowledge earned together. They sat by the fire, closer than before, not because a promise had been invoked, but because partnership had proven itself useful and true. She said then what she had not said before, that she would leave when the thaw came, that staying forever would be another kind of winter. He said he knew, and that knowing did not make the nights colder. They shared the remaining darkness with stories finally allowed to land, of rivers remembered, of losses named without theatrics, of futures imagined with room for change. The bed was shared in the way two survivors share a watch, warmth given without claim, sleep earned without debt. When spring edged the valley with green, she packed lightly as she always had, and stood at the threshold again, this time upright, this time choosing. They did not promise to find each other because promises can freeze too. They promised instead to remember what had been built in the cold and to carry the lesson forward. That mercy offered freely multiplies, that dignity is the strongest shelter, that survival is sweetest when it does not require the death of who you are. If this story stayed with you, if it warmed something you thought the cold had taken, subscribe to the channel and walk with us into the next firelit tale.